She was rejected on a Christmas blind date with her daughter until a single dad asked, "Can I join you?" Before we continue, tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. Harper Weston was standing in front of her bathroom mirror on Christmas Eve, trying to remember how to look like a woman who had her life together, instead of a single mom who hadn't slept properly in 2 years, and was honestly questioning every decision that led her to this moment. Her best friend Megan had been relentless about setting her up with this guy Brandon, swearing he was successful and charming, and exactly what Harper needed to finally move on from the disaster that was her ex-husband, who had walked out on Christmas Eve 2 years ago, like some kind of cruel holiday tradition she never asked for. Ivy appeared in the doorway, wearing her favorite red Christmas dress with the sparkly bow, her little face glowing with excitement as she watched her mommy put on lipstick and earrings like it was the most fascinating thing she'd ever witnessed. "Mommy, you look like a princess from my storybooks." And Harper felt tears prick her eyes because this 5-year-old was the only reason she'd survived the last 2 years. The only thing that made working double shifts and skipping meals and lying awake at night worrying about bills actually worth it. Then her phone rang, and Harper's carefully constructed evening fell apart in about 30 seconds flat when the teenage babysitter said her grandmother had been rushed to the hospital and she couldn't come. She was so sorry, Merry Christmas. Harper hung up and stared at her phone like it had personally betrayed her, scrolling through her contacts trying to find anyone who could watch Ivy on Christmas Eve with zero notice. But everyone was either busy with family or not answering because normal people didn't sit by their phones waiting to rescue desperate single moms. Megan's voice on the phone was practical when Harper called her in a panic. "Just bring Ivy with you. Any decent guy would understand. And if he doesn't, then you dodged a bullet anyway." Harper wanted to argue, but she was out of options and out of time. So she knelt down in front of her daughter and said, "Baby, Mommy needs you to come with me tonight. We're going on a little adventure." And Ivy's face lit up like Harper had just offered her a trip to Disney World instead of a blind date at a cafe. Ivy grabbed her hand and squeezed it tight, asking, "Mommy, are we going to find you a prince like in the movies?" And Harper laughed, even though her heart was breaking a little, because her daughter still believed in fairy tales, despite watching her parents' marriage explode 2 Christmases ago. She kissed Ivy's forehead and said, "Let's just see if he's nice first, okay, baby?" Knowing in her gut that bringing a 5-year-old to a blind date was probably a terrible idea, but having no other choice. They arrived at Evergreen Cafe, and the place was everything Harper had hoped it would be. Twinkling Christmas lights wrapped around every beam, a giant tree decorated with golden ornaments in the corner, and the smell of cinnamon and pine filling the warm air. Ivy gasped so loud that people at nearby tables smiled, and Harper felt her heart squeeze because her daughter found magic in everything, even when Harper couldn't see any magic left in the world. She spotted Brandon at a corner table already nursing a drink, and he looked exactly like his pictures, tall and well-dressed with the kind of confidence that came from never having to struggle for anything in his life. Harper took a deep breath and walked over with Ivy beside her, trying to project calm even though her pulse was racing and her palms were sweating. She watched his face change the moment he noticed the 5-year-old in the Christmas dress, watched his polite expression curdle into something cold and annoyed. Brandon didn't stand up to greet her, didn't smile at Ivy, didn't do any of the things a decent human being would do when meeting a child for the first time. He just looked at Harper with this irritated expression and said, "You didn't mention you had a kid," like Ivy was some kind of inconvenience, some kind of problem he hadn't signed up for. Harper started to explain about the babysitter emergency, but Brandon cut her off with a wave of his hand, saying he wasn't interested in playing stepdad, that he wanted a date, not a package deal. The next words out of his mouth would haunt Harper for weeks. "Look, I don't have time for this. Next time, be upfront about the baggage so guys like me don't waste our evenings." He said baggage loud enough for the tables around them to hear, threw some cash down like he was paying off an inconvenience, and stood up to leave without a single glance backward. The cafe was full of happy families and couples celebrating Christmas Eve, and Harper had just been humiliated in front of all of them. Ivy tugged on Harper's sleeve with confusion all over her little face. "Mommy, what's baggage? Am I baggage? Why was that man so angry at us?" and Harper's heart shattered into a million pieces because her 5-year-old daughter should never have to ask those questions, should never have to wonder if she was the reason Mommy couldn't find happiness. Harper pulled Ivy into her lap and buried her face in her daughter's hair, whispering, "No, baby, you're not baggage. You're my whole world. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." But her voice was cracking and tears were streaming down her face. She sat there holding Ivy, trying to pull herself together enough to leave with some shred of dignity, surrounded by the sounds of Christmas joy that felt like a mockery of everything she'd hoped tonight would be. This wasn't just about Brandon being a jerk. This was about every failed relationship and every man who'd looked at her like she wasn't enough. Every time she'd tried to open her heart only to have it thrown back in her face. She was 32 years old and starting to believe that maybe she just wasn't meant to be loved. Harper was reaching for her coat, ready to flee this cafe, and never look back when a voice came from beside their table, gentle and warm in a way that made her freeze mid-movement. "I'm really sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help noticing what happened, and that guy was a complete idiot." Harper looked up through blurry eyes and saw a man standing there with kind gray eyes and a little boy about 7 years old holding his hand, both of them looking at her with expressions of genuine concern. The man crouched down slightly so he was closer to eye level with her and said, "My son and I were about to order dinner, and honestly, Christmas Eve feels way too lonely to spend at separate tables. I was wondering if maybe we could join you, only if that's okay, of course. No pressure at all." His son waved shyly at Ivy and said, "Hi, I'm Theo. I'm 7. Do you like dinosaurs?" And Ivy's tear-streaked face transformed into wonder as she nodded enthusiastically and said, "I love dinosaurs. I have a T-Rex at home." Harper stared at this stranger, not understanding what was happening, because men didn't just walk up to crying women with children and offer to share dinner. That wasn't how the world worked. That wasn't how her world had ever worked. But he was standing there waiting patiently for her answer, while his son was already telling Ivy about his favorite dinosaur. And something about the warmth in his eyes made her want to believe that maybe not every man was like Brandon. Maybe not every evening had to end in disaster. "You really want to sit with us?" Harper asked, her voice still shaky from crying. "After all that mess?" The man smiled, and it reached all the way to his eyes. "Especially after all that. I'm Caleb, by the way, and this dinosaur expert is my son Theo." He gestured to the empty chairs at her table. "What do you say? I promise we're much better company than that jerk, though I've been told my jokes are pretty terrible, so you might regret this later." Ivy was already giggling at something Theo was saying about velociraptors, and Harper felt something shift in her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and nodded slowly. "Okay. Yeah, I'd like that." Caleb sat down across from her and signaled the waitress for more hot chocolate, and Harper watched her daughter laughing with this little boy like they'd known each other forever. And for the first time since Brandon had walked out, she thought maybe this Christmas Eve wasn't completely ruined after all. 2 hours disappeared like they were nothing, and Harper couldn't remember the last time she'd sat somewhere without checking her phone or calculating how much the bill was going to cost, or worrying about whether Ivy was being too loud for the other customers. Caleb had this way of making conversation feel effortless, asking questions that showed he actually wanted to know the answers instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. And Harper found herself laughing at his terrible dad jokes, even though they were objectively the worst jokes she'd ever heard in her life. Ivy and Theo had become instant best friends in the way that only children can, showing each other toys and making up stories about dinosaurs who celebrated Christmas and ate cookies instead of other dinosaurs. Mrs. Bellamy, the cafe owner, kept bringing extra treats to their table with knowing smiles. And at some point, Harper realized she'd stopped feeling like a failure and started feeling like maybe the universe had given her a gift wrapped in the most unexpected packaging imaginable. Caleb told her about his construction company and how he'd built it from nothing after years of working for other people. And Harper told him about her 2 jobs at the diner and the retail store, and how exhausted she was all the time, but how Ivy made every sleepless night worth it. He didn't look at her with pity the way most people did when they heard about her situation. He looked at her with respect, like working yourself to the bone, for your kid was something to admire rather than something to feel sorry about. She asked him about Theo's mom and watched his face shift into something painful before he said quietly that his wife Grace had passed away 3 years ago. A brain aneurysm that came out of nowhere and took her before anyone could do anything. Harper's hand moved across the table without her permission and covered his, and she said she was so sorry and meant it with everything she had because she knew what it was like to have your whole world collapse, even if her tragedy was abandonment instead of death. Caleb looked at their hands touching and then up at her face and said, "She would have liked you. Grace always had a thing for strong women who didn't take any crap from anyone." And Harper laughed even though her eyes were wet because somehow this stranger had seen her as strong when she'd been feeling so incredibly weak. The cafe was starting to close around them, and Mrs. Bellamy was giving them the gentle looks that said she didn't want to kick them out, but she did have a family to get home to on Christmas Eve. They bundled up the kids who were both half asleep and protesting that they weren't tired at all, despite yawning every 3 seconds. And Caleb walked Harper to her car, carrying Ivy because her little legs had given out about 10 feet from the door. He buckled Ivy into her car seat with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, tucking her blanket around her and making sure the straps weren't twisted. And Harper watched him with something fluttering in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. He handed her a napkin with his phone number scrawled on it in messy handwriting and said, "In case you ever want to do this again, no pressure, no expectations, just two single parents trying to survive the holidays." Harper took the napkin and smiled for real, the kind of smile that actually reached her eyes and said, "No blind dates required?" Caleb grinned and said, "Definitely no blind dates. I think we both had enough of those to last a lifetime." And Harper laughed as she got in her car and drove away watching him in the rearview mirror, still standing in the parking lot like he wanted to make sure she got off safely. The days after Christmas were filled with texts that started casual and quickly became the highlight of Harper's day. Little updates about Theo's latest dinosaur obsession and photos of failed attempts at cooking dinner and jokes that made her snort laugh at inappropriate moments during her shifts at the diner. Caleb sent her a picture of Theo wearing every single piece of Christmas present clothing at once and looking like a very fashionable marshmallow. And Harper sent back a video of Ivy singing a made-up song about her new friend Theo, who was the best dinosaur expert in the whole entire world. They met for coffee while both kids were at school, and it felt like picking up a conversation they'd never actually stopped having. Easy and natural in a way that made Harper nervous, because things that felt this good usually ended up hurting the most. Caleb told her more about Grace and the 3 years he'd spent feeling like half a person, and Harper told him about David walking out on Christmas Eve and how she'd spent months wondering what was wrong with her before realizing he was the broken one, not her. A week turned into 2 weeks, turned into a month, and suddenly Caleb and Theo were fixtures in Harper's life in a way she hadn't expected and wasn't sure how to handle. The four of them went to the park together, and Caleb pushed both kids on the swings while Harper sat on the bench laughing at his exaggerated sound effects. They had dinner at Harper's tiny apartment, and Caleb didn't comment on the second-hand furniture or the cramped kitchen, just rolled up his sleeves and helped her cook, while the kids played in Ivy's room. Ivy and Theo talked on the phone every night before bed, these rambling conversations about nothing and everything that could go on for an hour if the parents didn't intervene. And Harper would stand in the doorway listening to her daughter laugh and feeling something that was terrifyingly close to hope. Theo made Ivy a friendship bracelet out of string and beads, and she wore it every single day, even in the bath, until Harper had to explain that it would fall apart if it got too wet. One night after the kids had finally fallen asleep on Caleb's couch after a movie marathon, Theo mumbled something as Caleb was carrying him to bed that made Harper's heart stop. "Dad, is Miss Harper going to be my new mom? Because I think she'd be really good at it. And Ivy could be my sister." Caleb froze in the hallway and looked back at Harper with an expression she couldn't read, and she pretended she hadn't heard even though they both knew she had. Everything was perfect, and that's exactly when Harper's past decided to show up and ruin it, because apparently she wasn't allowed to have nice things without the universe testing her. David appeared at her door one afternoon, looking like he just stepped out of a magazine and acting like he hadn't abandoned his family 2 years ago, saying he'd heard she was seeing someone and he wanted to make sure she wasn't introducing strange men to his daughter. Harper stood in her doorway with her arms crossed, feeling all the old anger rise up in her chest as she reminded him that he'd lost the right to have opinions about her life when he walked out on Christmas Eve without looking back. David got that cold look in his eyes that she remembered from their worst arguments and said maybe he should talk to a lawyer about custody arrangements since she clearly wasn't making good decisions, and the threat hung in the air like poison. She didn't tell Caleb about David's visit because she was ashamed and scared and didn't want to drag him into her mess when things between them were still so new and fragile. Instead, she started pulling back, canceling plans at the last minute and taking longer to respond to texts and making excuses about being tired from work. Caleb noticed because, of course, he noticed. He noticed everything about her. And finally, he showed up at her door one evening after the kids were in bed, demanding to know what was going on. Harper tried to tell him nothing was wrong, but the words crumbled in her mouth when she saw the hurt in his eyes, and everything came pouring out about David and the threats and how she was terrified of losing Ivy, and how she didn't want to make Caleb's life complicated with her drama. He listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he took her hands and said, "I'm not him. I'm not going to leave because things get hard, and you don't have to carry this alone anymore." She wanted so badly to believe him, but the fear was bigger than the hope, and she heard herself saying, "I need time. I'm sorry, I just need time," and watching his face fall as she closed the door between them. She sat on her kitchen floor and cried, while Ivy slept peacefully in the next room, wondering if she just pushed away the best thing that had happened to her in years because she was too scared to let herself be happy. 2 weeks of silence stretched between them like an ocean. Harper didn't know how to cross, and every day felt heavier than the last because she'd pushed away the only person who'd made her feel whole in years, and she didn't know how to fix it. Ivy kept asking when they were going to see Theo again, and Harper kept making excuses about everyone being busy, watching her daughter's face fall a little more each time, until Ivy stopped asking altogether, which somehow hurt even worse than the questions. David made good on his threats, and suddenly Harper was drowning in legal paperwork and custody review requests and accusations that she was an unfit mother for letting Ivy walk around with strange men. And the lawyer she couldn't afford told her the case was weak, but it would still cost time and money she didn't have. She worked extra shifts to cover the legal fees and came home exhausted every night to a daughter who missed her friend and a phone that stayed silent because she'd told Caleb she needed space, and he was respecting that wish, even though it was killing them both. Then her car broke down on the coldest night of January, engine sputtering and dying on a dark road 3 miles from home, with Ivy bundled up in the back seat asking why the car was making funny noises. Harper sat there in the freezing darkness with her hands shaking on the steering wheel, scrolling through her contacts trying to find someone who could help. But the only person she wanted to call was the one she'd pushed away, and she wasn't sure she had the right to reach out anymore. Ivy's small voice came from the back seat, cutting through Harper's panic. "Mommy, why don't you call Mr. Caleb? He fixes things. Theo told me his daddy can fix anything." Harper stared at the phone in her hand, knowing her daughter was right, but terrified of what would happen if she made that call. Terrified he wouldn't answer. Terrified he would. She pressed his name before she could talk herself out of it, and he picked up on the first ring like he'd been waiting by the phone this whole time. "Harper, are you okay?" His voice was worried and warm, and hearing it made her start crying before she could even explain what was wrong. She managed to tell him where she was and that her car had died, and Ivy was in the back seat, and she was so sorry for calling, but she didn't know who else to reach out to. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions, just said, "I'm on my way, stay in the car and keep the doors locked. I'll be there in 15 minutes, and the line went dead. True to his word, his truck appeared in her rearview mirror exactly 14 minutes later, headlights cutting through the darkness like a rescue signal, and Harper felt something break open in her chest when she saw him jump out and run toward her car without even bothering to zip up his jacket. He didn't look at the engine first, didn't assess the mechanical problem like any normal person would. He just opened her door and pulled her into his arms and held her while she cried against his chest in the freezing cold. He got the car running again because, of course he did, it was just a loose battery cable that had come undone from the cold. And then he told her to follow him back to his place because there was no way he was letting her drive home alone in a car that might break down again. She wanted to argue, but she was too tired and too grateful, so she just nodded and followed his tail lights through the dark streets while Ivy chattered happily in the back seat about how she knew Mr. Caleb would save them. They sat in his living room after both kids had passed out on the couch wrapped in blankets, and Harper told him everything about David and the custody threats, and how scared she was of losing Ivy, and how she'd push Caleb away because she didn't want to drag him into her disaster. He listened to every word without interrupting, and when she was finally empty of words and tears, he took her hands and looked her straight in the eyes. I know a lawyer who helped me sort out custody stuff after Grace died. He's the best in the city, and he owes me about 15 favors. And tomorrow morning I'm calling him, and he's going to take your case. Harper started to protest about money, but Caleb shook his head. This isn't charity, Harper. This is me showing up for someone I care about. And you're going to let me help because that's what people who love each other do. The word love hung in the air between them, and neither of them looked away from it. Harper said quietly, I'm scared. I'm so scared of feeling this much and losing it. And Caleb pulled her closer and said, I'm scared too. I've been scared for 3 years, but I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you. She kissed him then because there were no more words left that could say what she was feeling. And for the first time since David's threats had started, she felt like maybe everything was going to be okay. The next few months were a blur of legal battles and court dates and gathering evidence that proved Harper was an incredible mother, and David was an absent father who only showed interest when someone else was loving his daughter better than he ever had. Caleb's lawyer friend demolished every accusation David threw at them, presenting records of missed child support payments and canceled visitations, and a pattern of abandonment that went back years. The judge saw through David's performance immediately and awarded full custody to Harper with a scathing assessment of fathers who only remembered they had children when it was convenient. Harper walked out of that courthouse holding Ivy's hand and feeling lighter than she had in years. And Caleb was waiting on the steps with Theo and a bouquet of flowers that Ivy immediately claimed as her own, because apparently 5-year-olds have no concept of romantic gestures. He hugged her tight and whispered, "You did it," in her ear, and she whispered back, "We did it," because there was no version of this victory that didn't include him. Summer came, and Harper and Ivy officially moved into Caleb's house, their boxes mixing with his boxes till nobody could remember what belonged to whom, and it didn't matter anyway because everything was theirs now. The kids got their own rooms side by side and spent an entire weekend decorating them, Theo's covered in dinosaurs and spaceships, and Ivy's covered in butterflies and flowers and one very determined T-Rex that Theo had insisted belonged on her wall too. Family dinners became a nightly ritual, and Harper would stand at the stove cooking while Caleb helped the kids with homework at the kitchen table. And sometimes she would just stop and watch them and wonder how she got so lucky after so many years of feeling like luck had forgotten she existed. Theo started calling her mom by accident and then on purpose, and then every single time he talked to her, and the first time Ivy called Caleb Daddy, he had to leave the room because he didn't want the kids to see him cry. Christmas Eve came around again exactly 1 year after they'd met, and Caleb insisted they go back to Evergreen Cafe for dinner, because he was sentimental like that, and also because Mrs. Bellamy would never forgive them if they celebrated anywhere else. The cafe looked exactly the same with its twinkling lights and giant tree, but Harper felt like a completely different person than the crying woman who'd sat at that corner table thinking her life was over. They sat at the same table and ordered the same hot chocolate, and the kids immediately started arguing about whether the cafe should get a dinosaur decoration for next year. And Harper watched this chaotic, beautiful family she'd somehow stumbled into and felt her heart overflow. Caleb was being weird all through dinner, checking his pocket every few minutes and giving Mrs. Bellamy significant looks that Harper pretended not to notice. Then he reached across the table and took her hand and said, "1 year ago, you walked into this cafe expecting another disappointment, and instead you found us. And I have spent every day since then grateful that your babysitter canceled and that jerk Brandon turned out to be exactly the idiot he was." Harper laughed through sudden tears because only Caleb would start a romantic speech by thanking a bad blind date for being terrible. He pulled out a small velvet box, and her hands flew to her mouth because she knew what was coming, but somehow still couldn't believe it was happening. Harper Weston, Will you marry me? Will you let us be your family forever? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel like baggage again? Ivy and Theo were bouncing in their seats, screaming, "Say yes, say yes!" And Mrs. Bellamy was already crying into her apron, and the entire cafe was watching. Harper nodded so hard she probably looked ridiculous, and saying, "Yes, yes, absolutely yes," through tears and laughter as Caleb slid the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. The kids launched themselves at both of them, creating a group hug that almost knocked over the table, and Mrs. Bellamy appeared with champagne and sparkling cider, announcing that everything was on the house because she'd been waiting a whole year for this moment. They got married the following summer in a garden full of flowers with Ivy as the flower girl and Theo as the ring bearer, both kids taking their jobs extremely seriously and only getting distracted twice by a butterfly and once by a very interesting rock. Theo read his vows first, saying, "Dear Mom, thank you for making my dad smile again. And for Ivy, I always wanted a sister even though she steals my dinosaurs sometimes." Ivy went next, saying, "Dear Daddy Caleb, thank you for finding us in the cafe. Santa told me good things happen to good people, and he was right." Harper and Caleb exchanged rings and promises and kissed while their children cheered, and Mrs. Bellamy sobbed in the front row next to Megan, who kept saying she'd known it would work out, even though everyone remembered her setting Harper up with Brandon in the first place. They posed for family photos, all four of them together, and Harper thought about how 1 year ago she'd been a crying mess at a cafe table, convinced she would never find love. Sometimes the worst nights lead you exactly where you need to be. Harper walked into that cafe expecting rejection and found the family she'd always dreamed of. Caleb sat down at a stranger's table and found the love he thought he'd lost forever. And two kids who'd been missing pieces of their families found each other and refused to let go. If this story reminded you that rejection is just redirection, that the right person won't see your child as baggage, and that sometimes a stranger asking, "Can I join you?" is the beginning of everything you've been praying for, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to believe that second chances are real and that love finds you when you finally stop running from it. Merry Christmas, and thank you for being here with us.